Okay, people, we are here in Williamsburg, Brooklyn right now. You can see I just took off my mask to do my little speech. Forgive me, I am a New York City tour guide, and I am more used to talking to people than electronic equipment from Japan. People can look back and nod, and, let's just say that what happens is I recognize that I'm talking to a machine, and then I get self-conscious because there's this weird existential feedback that happens. It's like, oh, you're not real, but wait, somebody's going to watch. And anyway, whatever. So here I am in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, at the Skyline, the East River, and I figured what we'd do today, since I no longer am employed as a New York City tour guide until further notice. Hopefully that'll be soon. Hopefully. But we're going to take a look at the Skyline, and we're going to really do sort of a rapid fire assessment of what these buildings are and if there's anything cool or important to mention about it. But I want you to know that this will only be a tiny percentage, a tiny reflection of what I know about New York City. And when I do tours, they're very seldom focused on the buildings themselves. These are just cool facts and, footprints, really, physical exaltations of what we valued in the times we built them. But hopefully you'll be able to take a tour of New York City in the future, and you can always hit me up. In the meantime, with no further ado, let's take a look at this Skyline. Alright, we're going to take a look at the New York City Skyline. No one asked for it, but the coronavirus is going on, and I lost my job, and I'm bored, and I guess I want attention. So here we go. We're going to first zoom in right here to the obvious. This is 432 Park Avenue, perhaps the most hated of all the mega towers in New York. People see this as a vulgar testament to billionaires ruling over us as the gods to the Romans. But this building, love it or hate it, is actually quite impressive. If you look here, you're going to see that there is a gap in the building, right? You can kind of see that naked gap, and then boom, there's another one. Now, forgive me, by the way, this camera, I'm zoomed all the way in, and it's really difficult to keep it stable. So we're going to have a little bit of shaky cam. Hopefully none of you are, faint of stomach. Anyway, so what happens? Let's say you go to the top of the Empire State Building, right? And you've got a hat on. Your hat is going to blow off at some point. Why? Because the Empire State Building is one of the most turbulent places in New York. It's not surrounded by other skyscrapers, and so wind will hit the building and have nowhere to go but up. And this creates all kinds of stress problems and drag, and if you're at the top, it creates a lot of turbulence. Now, this building doesn't have an observation deck, so it's not that you need to protect the hats of people up there. No one's going to be up there. But understand that if this building is to be hit with really, really high winds, it could eventually cause stress problems, and windows will become unhinged and pop out and things of this nature, right? But no, the wind actually very cleverly passes through this almost like a channel of diversion and creates little whirlwinds without causing structural problems. So it's actually very clever engineering-wise, but oh my God, is this building hated. Now, the top floors of this building are actually owned by a Saudi mega billionaire named, and forgive me, I have an American tongue, so it might be mispronounced, but Fawaz Al-Kahar. And contrary to what people would assume, this guy is not Saudi royalty. He is some sort of self-made billionaire, I believe, in the real estate industry. But whatever the case is, he bought the top floor for about $90 million. Now, keep in mind, that's like $15 million off the list. And the building opened in 2015. And for those that live in New York, we kind of see it as sort of like Genesis for the billionaires row. How do I put this? Like, you know how God said, let there be light? Right? Well, the billionaires and those that control the world's economy said, let there be 432 Park Avenue. Right? And then all the heavens and earth opened up, and then boom, here come the other properties of Billionaires Row. You see these? This is all part of Billionaires Row. We're going to be getting to this in a minute. But this is sort of like Genesis. This is the Adam and Eve of Billionaires Row. This building, for that reason, is hated. People see this as a pivotal moment in the history of New York, and historians will argue about it for years and years to come. All right, down here is one of the weirdest stories in the history of New York City skyscrapers. This with the weird slanted roof right here in the center of the camera is a building called the Citicorp Tower. Now, it opened up roughly the same time as the World Trade Center Twin Towers. And the World Trade Center Twin Towers were pretty much commercially successful given their proximity to New Jersey, which is where all the people were buying properties and where you're going to have your commuters coming in from. So this building really didn't wind up headline. It was never a headline news type of building, but something happened not long after the building opened up that, trust me, if you don't believe me, you can look this story up because it sounds ridiculous. You see, the engineer, the architect or designer, whoever it is, the most important guy who in charge of this building's construction, was doing some sort of college lecture, I think as the story goes, and there was a female student at this lecture who was doing her thesis on the engineering of this building and asked a very simple question about the building's structural integrity. And I guess right there on the stage, the architect of the building figured out that this girl was onto something. And after a little bit of research and calculation, determined that, if a windstorm with gusts of more than 60 miles an hour hits New York for any short extended period of time, the building will snap and fall down onto the city beneath it, causing just billions in damage and life lost. So that was a catastrophe that everybody wanted to avoid, but they didn't want this in the press. Obviously, they didn't want to tarnish their own good standing in the development world. But also keep in mind that New York City itself had a vested interest in this not being controversy, given that this was the 1970s when people were leaving New York City by the thousands every day with no new residents coming in to replace them. So they don't need any more bad press. So what happens is the developers and the city agree that they can fix this building from the inside out, but without the public's knowledge of it. So what happened was they opened the building was already open for business, and there were people working there every day, never realizing that their lives were in some degree in jeopardy. Although windstorms of that magnitude hit New York really not much more than like once every 20 years. But I mean, it was eventually going to happen. Eventually it did happen in 2012 with Hurricane Sandy, but that's beside the point. So what happens is that they hired this sort of like elite, think like Mission Impossible or like Ocean's 11, like team of like construction workers, right? These union guys who come in here after everybody leaves on their trains to go home from their 9 to 5. So in the middle of the night, every night, for several years, construction workers showed up and replaced every single nut and bolt in this building with a welded steel panel. Now, to do this wound up costing more in retrofitments than the building's construction. But they were able to get this complete, and no one was the wiser for it. And the tragedy, or the catastrophe, was avoided. And here's the craziest part. The public was not made aware of this retrofitment until the 2000s, some 30 years after they actually upgraded the building. Now, what I wonder about is the guys that actually who actually did the retrofitments, because these were like union guys, contractors who have wives and kids and all of this, and they have to work overnight every night, but they've signed a non-disclosure agreement that they cannot speak about what they do. This is some top secret stuff. And I'm sorry, but if you're a blue-collar guy and you come home at 8 o'clock in the morning every day and you tell your wife that the government says you can't talk about your job and it's top secret, right, and that your safety is in jeopardy, right, I think you're probably just better off telling you have an addiction to prostitutes. We're looking at 111 West 57th Street. Look at this thing. Even its address is skinny. 111 West 57th Street. I don't know. 1 is the skinniest number or something. But anyway, look at this thing. Known in New York as the Steinway Tower because it's actually built on top of the old Steinway showroom where they used to sell pianos around the world. It's at 57th Street. This building is the skinniest skyscraper in the world. And I kid you not. Now, there's, plenty of taller buildings, but this one feels like it's the tallest in the world, but it's not. It's just so skinny. Now, how skinny is it? Well, all right, look at the Empire State Building, right? The Empire State Building, it has a base to height ratio of 1 to 7. Now, that means that the Empire State Building is 7 times taller than the base is wide. The base that it occupies is wide. So, and keep in mind, in 1931, right, the Empire State Building was considered, as tall as humanly possible to build. If you build with a 1:8 base to height ratio, the building's going to fall over. That's what engineers believed, and at the time, given their technology, that was probably accurate. But here, we've got a building, not with a 1:7 base to height ratio, but with a 1:24 base to height ratio. Now that means that this building is actually 24 times higher than the property on which it sits is wide. Now when it opens up, it's going to have, I believe the penthouse is going to be listed at like 70 million, which is actually, I don't want to say it's a steal, but compared to some of the other properties you're going to hear about, it's actually what you might consider a good deal. Okay, 157 West 57th Street was on 57th Street, the first of the major towers. And keep in mind, there was no skyline here as recently as like 2010. So all of this is brand new. This is the future of New York we're talking about here. The top floors of this sold for $101 million, making it the most expensive penthouse ever sold in New York, but that's about to change. Anyway, that sold to a guy named Michael Dell. You've probably heard the name Michael Dell. He is a mega billionaire. He started a computer company. I'll leave it to you to figure out which computer company Michael Dell started. But anyway, that's 157 West 57th Street. Right over here is actually just a few blocks downtown. It looks like it's all part of the same assortment of buildings, but it's actually not. This is the MoMA Tower. This is at 53rd, 217 West 57th Street. Known best as the Extell Tower, formerly the Nordstrom Tower. Now, the thing about this building will be the tallest residential building in the world when it's complete. Okay, some of you have been to Dubai and you'll say, oh, Dubai's got taller buildings. Yes, they do have taller buildings, but this is a residential only building. See, in Dubai they have a lot of mixed use properties, right? So you'll have a building with apartments, a hotel, and an indoor skiing, mountain or something. They do have that at the Burj Khalifa, by the way. But this building is exclusively residential. What that means, and by the way, how many apartments do you think the biggest residential tower, look at this thing, how many apartments do you think that's going to have? 1,000? 2,000? Look at this. No, 60. That's it, 60 apartments. Now, when it's done, 20 of the 60 apartments are going to be priced at more than $50 million. And the top floors here, are part of a giant multiplex that's going to be listed for $275 million, which will be the the most expensive residential unit ever marketed in the history of New York. Anyway, let's just say that they're not marketing these units to school teachers and firemen and city council workers. I mean, this is for the world's elite. That's why they call this the Billionaires Row. Now, what we have to understand, guys, is that you think, well, okay, we're going to bring all that billionaire money in New York. That's a really good thing. And in some ways it is, right? I mean, look at all the people that worked the construction jobs didn't have any complaints, right? Those are good paychecks. But let's pretend, because we're going to kind of examine now the negative economic consequences of, selling New York to... And keep in mind, the people that buy these units, I mean, if you buy a $275 million unit, are you going to live in it? Probably not, because if you have that kind of money, you probably also own your own little private island. And you're going to look at this not as a home, but no differently than you and I might look at a stock in our stock portfolio, right? This is an investment. This is not a place to live. That's why they call these ghost apartments and ghost towers. Maybe you've heard that term being used in real estate setting. Ghost apartments and ghost towers. So let's just say you have a pizza shop on the ground level across the street. You got your lease in 1999, a 20-year lease. Okay, so 20 years go by, you're selling pizza at $2 a slice. People love your pizza. Everybody that's got a job down here loves your pizza. But 20 years is up and the owner comes back to you, and one of two things is going to happen. He's going to say, look, you had a good 20-year run, but I just sold the property, and now they tear your pizza place down and build another skyscraper next door, right, to try the same rental property selling scheme to billionaires around the world. Or the owner of the property where your pizza place is located is going to say, look, I'm holding out for a bigger offer, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to sign you another lease, and this time I'm going to charge you 7 times the rent. Now, of course, what you do is you cannot afford that. Even if your pizza place is successful, you cannot afford to pay 7 times the rent. You simply will go out of business. I mean, you're not going to sell a slice of pizza for $30 plus tax, right? So you have no choice but to leave, and your pizza place fails. You go out of business. And that's why if you walk around the area, I mean, retail's dying anyway, but if you walk around these areas, it's like Soho and 57th Street in this case, and look at the ground level, you're going to see the stores that are in business say everything must go, store closing, and the ones that are out of business, they say retail space available. Well, what you might not know about this building is it really is the apex of America's economic leap forward after World War I. You have to understand something. This building, you might think, oh, it's a Chrysler building, so it's a monument to cars, but actually nobody looks at this building and thinks about cars. I think a lot of people look at this building and they just get an implicit sense of that this is a building representative of the most optimistic moment in American history. And given that it has all the bells and whistles and all of the illustrious over-the-top design, it really is a reminder of a time when we had so much self-confidence. Keep in mind, this is a country that 20 years before this building was conceived had just opened up an island where, run by the federal government, where we let people in from pretty much all over the world, people that were not wanted in their countries, who were at the bottom of the economic food chain, were now going to be coming into America and be given all kinds of opportunities to make a name for themselves by starting their own business without any real government interference. So this would be like planting the seeds for what would in 20 years become a middle class. Add World War I to the mix, and now, add World War I to the mix, and now we've got Europe is starving, right? The world is in ruins, but America comes out of World War I as for the first time ever in its existence, not a, but the world power. And the very people who were not wanted in their countries are now America's middle class, while their former countrymen are suffering in the ashes of World War I. 20 years ago, you had nothing, but now you're buying stocks and bonds, and you're having kids, and you're buying a toaster and a radio, and there's a consumer economy, and everything's bustling and blooming like flowers of opportunity across the nation. This building reminds us of that moment. But it was built just a little bit preemptively, because not even 2 years after this building opens, the economy absolutely tanks. And shortly thereafter, this building really, I imagine people in the 1930s looked at it and didn't see it as this beautiful reminder of all that's possible, but rather a tower of lies. Right? But rather they may have looked at it like a decadent symbol of all of the failed promises of the last decade. Now, if you actually look carefully at the Chrysler Building, there's a needle through the center. Now, did they have a helicopter to drop this thing in or something? Well, in 1927, there was no such thing as a helicopter. The way this building's needle got up there is actually through the center of the building. So sort of like, you know how click pencils work? It's the exact same concept. They built the needle inside the building and then click, 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 click through the center. They sealed it in, and then it became the tallest building in the world. There's more that could be said about the Chrysler Building, but right now we're going to move on and we're going to take a look right here to the left. The MetLife Tower, originally called the Pan Am Building. The Pan Am Building sits directly on top of Grand Central. So this is all 42nd Street if you're not from New York. If you are from New York, I know I'm stating the obvious. But actually, technically, MetLife is 45th Street, but in front of it is Grand Central Terminal. Now, what is Grand Central? Well, it is a hub for trains. It's where the New York Central Rail trains all, terminated, and then switch over to the New York City subway system, which at the time was private, not a municipal service. Now, what is Grand Central? It's a hub for trains. What was this? This was the height of the aviation empire. It was Pan American. It was only thing comparable was TWA. That was Howard Hughes' company. And what's this? The monument to the Chrysler automobile, where we're looking at the plane, the train, and the automobile. So just like when you go downtown to Wall Street, you can't understand Lower Manhattan without understanding commerce, trade, finance. Well, the same thing goes in Midtown for transportation. One cannot walk around Midtown and learn anything without understanding Midtown's roots in what would become the early 20th century transformation of transportation. Right? Grand Central, you can't see it here. It's buried, it's surrounded by other buildings. But when Grand Central was built, there were no other buildings around it. It was new transportation systems that allowed people to come up here. When Lower Manhattan was when it first became the economic heart of America, this was all, dirt roads out in the country. So you have to understand, it was like an hour on a horse and carriage to get up here. And, in the era before telephones, if you have a stock and you want to sell your stock, you have to go downtown and sell your stock on Wall Street or send a catalogue. And not everybody had access to that kind of technology. So when we think about Midtown, it's impossible to understand it without understanding the implications that new transportation opportunities we're going to have on the the movement of people and the expansion of real estate opportunities. So no transportation, no Midtown. And that's why you have, the biggest bus terminal in America is on 42nd Street. The second biggest train station in America is on 42nd Street. The Chrysler Building, right? You get what I'm saying. Anyway, Pan Am went bust after the Lockerbie explosion over Ireland. I think it was Ireland or Scotland in the 1980s. And it's MetLife. It's an insurance company. So things have obviously changed. And Chrysler is not in the Chrysler Building and haven't been for several years. 1 Vanderbilt Avenue, another building whose estimated date of completion is thrown into complete chaos given the state of the world right now. But one thing we can tell you about 1 Vanderbilt Avenue is that a building of this magnitude in this location directly next door to Grand Central cannot be built without a few palms being greased. Now, if you know anything about New York, at least in the last decade, one of our biggest concerns is about the state of the New York City subway. The subway is an early 20th century undertaking that has to meet the demands of 21st century expectations of movement. And no matter how nice you make the subway or how much money you throw at it, it's only going to move at the speed of 1904. Anyway, there are a lot of financial concerns about the future of the New York City subway. And so if you want to build something this big next door to the second busiest train terminal in America after Penn Station at 34th Street, well then, how about this? We'll let you build this giant building if you can promise a little bit of assistance with the New York City subway. So what did they pledge to the New York City subway system? $250 million. Now, of course, before COVID, it was estimated that the New York City subway is going to need $30 billion in the next some 30 years. It's probably going to need a lot more now. I mean, I rack my brain trying to imagine what the New York City subway is going to go through in the wake of COVID. But with ridership at all-time lows, by the way. I mean, ridership is probably not going to improve even after there's a vaccine. People are, I think, now going to be dedicated to finding alternate means of moving around in New York. But maybe that's just me being pessimistic. Anyway, they pledged $250 million to the subways underneath it. So if you were to go to Grand Central like today, and then go into the subway, the 4, 5, 6, as well as the shuttle trains, you'll see that there are massive upgrades being done as we speak. In fact, the 456 station underneath Grand Central has recently been completed, and if you go there, it's a brand new station. And it's all thanks in no small part to the developers of 1 Vanderbilt. Now, when this building opens, I believe the anchor tenant is going to be TD Bank, which is a Toronto-based bank. It's a Canadian bank, whose new world headquarters is going to be here. You would think the financial district, but if you think the financial district is downtown, you're thinking like it's still the 20th century. You're thinking like it's a pre-9/11 world. In fact, let's just get right to it. You see right here, this is the Bank of America Tower, which opened in March of 2009, not even 5 months after the biggest financial crisis in living memory. This is at the southeastern corner of Times Square, but the northeastern corner of Bryant Park. Now, Times Square in the 1970s and 80s was not the Disney-run, family-friendly shopping mall that it is today. Times Square was actually, for lack of a better term, the the mecca for low culture. Now, of course, there was Broadway theater culture, which did have prestige, but let's be honest, in an era before there was porn on the internet, you had to actually, well, yeah, you had to go to porn theaters like Pee Wee Herman. And how do I put this? In the 80s, when the crack epidemic hit New York, this was one of the premier centers for distribution of street-based sales, right? So you buy drugs in Times Square, and then you do them in Bryant Park. So Bryant Park had a really nasty reputation for homelessness and drug addiction and all of this. Now, in the 1990s, when Disney did buy into Times Square, they wanted to, revolutionize the area. And when Giuliani became mayor, he pushed the BID model, which stands for Business Improvement District. And this is basically corporate incentives, tax incentives for big corporations to beautify the area and be supportive. Sort of like think of the corporations as a board of trustees. So if you were to go to Bryant Park, again, next door to this building, is not a public park. It's actually run entirely with not a single tax dollar goes to Bryant Park. It's 100% private, and it's run by companies that surround it. So let's just say that Bryant Park was still dangerous. If it were still dangerous, full of drug addiction and all of this, then this building would not be worth the $2 billion plus that it's worth today. So it's very much in Bank of America's best interest for Bryant Park to be a very prestigious park. It secures the property value of this investment. So if you were to go to Bryant Park in a year other than 2020, there'll be big events. And all of the big events, from the movies in the summer to the ice skating rink in the winter, are paid for by Bank of America. So think of Bryant Park next door as Bank of America Park. Over here, we've got the Condé Nast building. Now, it's actually owned by a Swedish company today. You know them, H&M, the famous Swedish retailer. But they bought this from Condé Nast, who owned the building until 2014, when World Trade Center Tower 1 opened. So today, Condé Nast, which, by the way, for those not familiar with Condé Nast, is print media. What's left of print media, anyway. Vogue magazine, GQ, Golf Digest, Travel magazine, Bon Appetit, Town and Country. Magazines like this. The stuff that you see at the dentist office and don't pick up. All right, so we're scanned down now. This is the Bellevue Hospital Center, and forgive me if I sound emotionally divorced from the topic of COVID-19. That's not. I didn't want to make this a video about that. Just wanted to be purely informational. But this is basically ground zero for the fight on COVID-19, although that's going on throughout hospitals in New York. This is the one that perhaps gets the most press, as it's our oldest and most prestigious and most historically significant hospital. Now, when I say our oldest hospital, I mean America's oldest hospital. And quite noteworthy, it was most famous for its mental asylum, which today, let's just say the practices there would not go unnoticed if they were to still happen. Okay, you see these brown buildings right here? This is Tudor City. Now, Tudor City was built in the 1920s. Look at these amazing apartments. Well, in the 1920s, middle class now had more movement. They existed now, and they had movement that they did not have 20 years earlier, as I was saying earlier. So Midtown, again, would not exist without the new transportation systems to move people around. But now that people can move around, why even stay in New York at all? Let's move to Westchester. Let's move out to the country. And so really what these were was a real estate strategy to keep people living in New York City, to keep them from going out. Today, though, it is absolutely not for any middle class whatsoever. In fact, Turtle Bay is the Tudor City is part of what makes Turtle Bay one of the most expensive areas to live in all of New York City. We've got the United Nations, and I guess I'm not here to really comment on as to whether or not the United Nations is a valid use of the world's resources, or if nations are going to do what nations are going to do, or if really the United Nations has benefited the world. Many are in disagreement over this, but I'm not here to comment on that. What I'm here to say is that it used to be a slaughterhouse, and that if you try to mail a letter to the United Nations, it won't go through, because you can't mail one because it doesn't have a zip code because it's not even in America. It is a sovereign nation where 193 nations of the world come together, unite, and I don't know, talk about, you know, whether or not Carol Baskin actually had her husband killed. I have no clue what they talk about. Right here, we're going to zoom in at 50th and Park Avenue at these twin tips of a building known as the Waldorf Astoria, a hotel so nice they actually built it twice. Originally on 34th and 5th, and torn down in 1929. In order to make way for the Empire State Building, the Waldorf Astoria was moved here, and I believe opened in 1938. Now, every U.S. president, from Franklin Roosevelt all the way to Barack Obama, have spent the night. And of course, our current president stays somewhere over here. We really can't see Trump Tower. I'm sure some of you are happy about that. But anyway, the next president spend the night at the Waldorf? The answer to that is no, because, well, in 2014, in October, the Waldorf Astoria, the famous American hotel, was sold to China. And what China is going to do is turn it into, well, they're in the process of luxury apartments. In a strange world we live in, because 20 years ago, hotels were hotels and apartments were apartments. But now, thanks to Airbnb, apartments are hotels. And of course, every famous hotel in New York is becoming private apartments. We've seen a true polar reversal here. Now, one president of the United States stayed here but hated it, refused to go back, and went to the Carlisle, subsequently as president every time he was in New York since, and that was President John F. Kennedy. Now, of course, you might speculate as to why Kennedy disliked the Waldorf, and it's really kind of a no-brainer when you put two and two together. You see, John F. Kennedy was the very first Catholic president ever, and while that might not seem controversial to us today, it certainly was something that the old Protestant order scoffed at. And if you're president, I mean, that's the most power you can have in America, yet it's not going to stop people from scoffing at you when you walk through the doors. So to him, this must have been sort of like a reminder of a culture that he would never be welcomed into. The President Franklin Roosevelt, actually, this is actually quite fascinating, would arrive in New York on train, right? You didn't have Air Force One, you had Rail Force One. And he'd be switched to a single-car armored Rail Force One train, and underneath Park Avenue, he would be whisked to the Waldorf Astoria, to a private elevator from the railroad station underneath up to his presidential suite. Now, that rail car still sits here to this very day. Now, I don't even know where to begin when talking about the importance of this building. I guess the first thing I'm going to say about the Empire State Building is that look at it. Look at how iconic it is. But there's a lot of things we can actually read about this building just by looking at where it stands. Number one, this building was a huge failure. In fact, the fact that this building was a failure is actually one of its greatest achievements. And just bear with me on this. You see, if this building had been successful, look at all these other buildings here, okay? You build like 5 to 10 of these skyscrapers because you build, right? You build, where is it? 432 Park Avenue, which is the first of its kind over there. Now we can't see the damn thing, but you get the idea. But if you build a major tower and it causes property value escalations, it's like a shark feeding frenzy. You put blood in the water and the sharks freak out, and they are looking for food. Well, basically, you create economic potential. When this building was being built, no other developers were influenced to come to the area and develop. So it stands alone. And that's because everybody kind of understood that this was a huge risk to build over at 34th and 8th, particularly at the moment it was built. Now, I guess the easy way to say this is that if this building were successful, there would be other giant towers surrounding it. And therefore, if that was the case, it would not stand so proudly alone in its 134th Street location. Now, of course, you have to understand, when we look at the Chrysler Building, right, the Chrysler Building was built at a time of economic gains, significant economic gains. The Empire State Building was a little late to the party. In fact, what is the most iconic building, perhaps, in the United States of America, right, was built at the lowest point in our economic history. So we built the the highest thing at the lowest point. We built the symbol of pride and prosperity at a time of weakness and ruin. Okay, the Empire State Building, for the first 20 years of this building, less than 10% of it was actually occupied. Okay, think about that. Johnny Roscoe, the guy who built the Empire State Building, you might describe him as a Keynesian economist, right? He was one of these guys that believed that there's no Great Depression. No, no, no. We'll spend our way out. You know, if you build it, they will come. If you build it, they will come. So he built it, and no one came. It was a huge failure. And of course, businesses had all been failing over the last 2 years. Why build a giant tower to house businesses that don't even exist? And those that do won't even be able to afford to have a space here. But what this building did do was it employed a lot of people to build it. And those people that built the Empire State Building were so happy to be employed during the Great Depression that they worked hard and they worked fast. And they built this entire building from soup to nuts, from the first brick to the ribbon cutting ceremony, in 1 year, 1 month, and 21 days. Keep in mind, these are not just jobs in New York. You think that there's some local economy that's being supported, but the glass was all manufactured in Oregon, right? The steel was all Pennsylvania, and there were, Pittsburgh, and there were all, people who worked on railroads and on boats and canals that all came together to put this building together. In fact, the streamlined nature of this building's construction was as such that when the steel arrived to be put into place, it was still really warm to the touch. That's how recently it had all been manufactured. Anyway, to this very day, the building makes more off people going to the top than it does off rent. But that, well, not this year anyway. This year it's a little different. In fact, we're looking at a building who at any given day of any given year, you'll even see camera flashes going off the top in the day, but not today. There is no observation deck at the Empire State Building. There is no tourism in New York, which is in part why I'm sitting here making this video, because I am not working. Alright, now things get a little bit weird when you get over here because we're looking at New York from a bizarre angle. So you might find it hard to believe, but this building, this building right here is at 34th Street. And yet right here, this building is at 25th Street. So these buildings are 9 blocks, this building is 9 blocks south of this one, but it looks like it actually might be north of it. It's not, it's just the angle that I'm sitting at right now. Basically, I'm facing north, right? So this is going uptown. So that's all like northwest. And this is north. So we're really crossing New York at a bizarre angle because this is 34th Street, and this is 25th Street, and this is 34th Street again. So it's a little bit confusing. We're going to start with this one. This is a brand new building. In fact, I kind of feel bad because see this weird little slip off the side of the building? That's sort of like a little restaurant observation deck thing for tourists. This is, and it opened like, what, 2 weeks before the economy was shut down last month? So this is all brand new, and it's already languishing in economic ruin. This is, in fact, part of a complex known as the Hudson Rail Yards, the biggest and most expensive commercial and private development in the history of the United States of America. Several $billion from companies around the world to make this thing happen. And of course, at least it's not a football stadium like former Mayor Bloomberg wanted to go in this location. Now, this actually is where the High Line ends. So if you were to come to New York and walk around on the High Line and just take it to the very end, you'd arrive at this building. Perhaps you've seen all over Instagram all the images of that weird new beehive-looking structure, right? What is that called? The vessel, right? It's actually quite beautiful, even though most New Yorkers hate it. That's right at the feet of this building. The Metropolitan Life Insurance Tower we're looking at was actually the tallest building in the world in the year 1909. So 110 years ago, this was the tallest building in the world. Now look at it. See what I mean? Yeah, not so much anymore. But this was quite an achievement. Now it actually looks a bit more modern than you would expect from 1909. Well, in reality, it had more neoclassical detail when it first opened, but in the 1980s, rather than restore the cornices in the building, the owner decided to chop them all off. So what I mean by cornices are like overhangs that have flowery sort of ornamentation. This was in the 1980s, and there's a famous case at Columbia University where a student was killed by a chunk of an old building that just fell off after years of being rained on, and basically the stone eroding and rotting and cracking. And that's a lot of liability for building owners, and so you come up with compromises. And in this case, rather than restore all those cornices, they just sort of chopped them off, giving the building a more sort of modern aesthetic, but yet true to its original form. Now, if you look at the clock, can we even see the clock on this damn thing? I can't even tell if we can see the clock or not, because I have so much contrast on the camera that I can't tell if we can see the clock. I don't think we can. But if you were to actually go up to this building and look at the clock, you'll see that there's all kinds of little flowery detail around the clock, and that was not removed. So if you were to look at that flowery detail and just imagine it all over the rest of the building, that's what you would see. Now, anyway, it's not that interesting to talk about life insurance, so we're just going to move on. You see, here's the East River, and New York skyline is determined by the ground itself. We have bedrock that is close to... Now, if you go to a city like Shanghai in China, the city is sinking beneath the weight of buildings. Not in New York. Okay, our bedrock, Manhattan, as it were, is basically allows us to build with impunity to the sky. But if you were to start digging with the shovel over here, you'd have to dig pretty deep before you actually got to the bedrock, and that means that building a foundation of a building is a lot more expensive. And because of that, commercial properties all moved to where they could be built more easily. Today, the technology definitely exists to build a skyscraper right here, but nobody wants to bother doing it because there's no economic interest, because all of that's already moved over here. Now, these down here are known as Peter Cooper Village. And actually, let's just see if we can scan the lower part of the skyline here. Peter Cooper Village is a post-World War II one of the early housing projects. It was originally meant to house World War II soldiers, part of the GI Bill. Okay, so with that was basically the New York City skyline, and I wanted to give that to you, free of charge. Basically, I'm not working, and if there's anything I want you to take away from this video is that alright, so look, I've been told that my job as a New York City tour guide is non-essential, and fair enough, because right now, where I'm alone, by the way, social distance. There's nobody around me. If you look, you see what I mean. All right? Nobody around me. It's a lonely pursuit, but it's a worthwhile one. We want to be socially responsible, but also you have to come outside and be responsible to your psychological well-being. I mean, if you're quarantining somewhere, I don't know, Texas, Oklahoma, somewhere, there's a lot of space. I mean, you might have a life where you're not around people all the time anyway, and so you might not feel the psychological difference. And you've got all kinds of space. Whereas in New York, space is the ultimate commodity. You might live in an apartment that's very small, and so if you're locked in that shoebox apartment for days on end and you don't have a backyard, you can start to grate at your soul, at your spirit. Plus, for someone like me who has the non-essential job, I have zero income right now. I'm supposed to get this pandemic money, but it's been, 6 weeks already, and I haven't seen a dime of it, and I'm being told that it's going to be at least another 3 weeks. And at that point, I'm going to be running on fumes. And keep in mind, I'm one of the guys that saved money. And that's all going to go away. And, that can come back. But what I'm concerned about is that there's a little bit of cynicism and desperation and fear among circles of people that work in either entertainment industries or, in my case, the tourism industry, that our jobs aren't coming back. And if they are to come back, they won't come back for such a long time that many of us, if not all of us, will have had no other choice but to pursue other means of income. And You know, the economic devastation that this shutdown is going to impart on us is not something we will really fully comprehend for some time. And, you know, we're all in this together, but also we have personal responsibilities to our own well-being. Now, I will say that I love my job, and I've been very fortunate. It's funny, I don't really go to bed. I didn't really go to bed for the last 13 years that I've been a tour guide. I haven't really gone to bed at night, and, you know, thanked my lucky stars that I got to do a job that I love. But I was always sort of acutely or silently appreciative that I like my job, and I hope I have it back soon. Now, there's a lot of people that I know that are saying, oh, tourists aren't going to want to come here. They're going to be afraid that, you know, New York is going to be some sort of weird, you know, breeding ground for infectious disease. But, you know, new information is coming out that apparently this COVID shit has been here since January, and that, you know, already 20% of New Yorkers have already gotten it and recovered and didn't even know it. So that the death toll might actually be a lot lower in percentage. But it's really hard to say. We don't really, it's hard to calibrate your own opinions or speculate on what the future is going to be. I want to remain optimistic that people are coming back to New York and that they'll want to participate in things like guided walking tours, which is what I do. But I also want to remain realistic, and, you know, it's just hard to tell the difference between being fearful and being realistic right now. Anyway, let this message reaches you. I just hope that you and your family, the next time you decide to go on a big vacation, that you come to New York and that you don't have that anxiety. And hopefully the nation will be so sick of all this quarantine. You know, the funny thing is, like, we all have this social media, and we act like it's this great compliment to our lives. But it, you know, for the last several years anyway, it's barely been a compliment to life so much as a supplement to our lives, in place thereof a life. That if we can convince ourselves that our lives are so peachy and wonderful and put it up on the internet, then if somebody else thinks it's true, then it's somehow validated. And I think that when people travel and they go to places, and I see the looks on people's faces when they get in touch with New York, when they get a perspective on New York, when they recognize themselves not simply as witnesses or visitors to New York, but active participants in its existence, that they'll realize that you know, that these are their buildings too, these are their stories too. And, you know, people have an appreciation, and they don't get that from, you can't get that from doing some social media thing or some Instagram or like just Wikipediaing information about the places that you're visiting. This is not an essential job at the moment, but when we're back to good times and there's culture, this is absolutely an essential pursuit. And I don't want you guys to have any, but besides, when things go back, like, there's going to be all sorts of new precautions that are taken. So you can rest assured that that the tour that you take in the big city in the future, that the tour guides will be sort of well versed on, you know, what is appropriate distances between people, and what is appropriate conduct and clothing to wear, etc., etc. So hopefully that puts your mind at ease. Hopefully you learned a couple of cool things. Now, all we did is look at the skyline. There's a whole lot more on the ground level. A whole lot more on the ground level worth discussing. Right now, I'm not really in a position to walk around with the camera. We're still in major lockdown mode, but hopefully we'll get a day soon when they ease those restrictions, and I can get you more content. You know, send something in the comments. Let me know how you think I could go about explaining New York to people in an engaging way. And I hope you guys are safe, and I hope to you and each of your families, I give you my best wishes for a happy and healthy 2020. Take care.